Immigration to the territory that became the United States began without formal federal regulation, governed instead by local colonial practices and British imperial oversight. In the colonial era, entry remained largely open to Europeans who could afford passage or secure indenture, while colonies imposed ad hoc restrictions on paupers, criminals, and those with contagious diseases to avoid public burdens. Forced migration of enslaved Africans and transportation of British convicts occurred outside voluntary immigration frameworks. No uniform national laws existed until the federal government assumed authority under the Constitution. Early federal legislation focused primarily on naturalization rather than admission, reflecting priorities of population growth through compatible European settlement. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted citizenship to free white persons of good character, establishing racial boundaries while encouraging inflows for expansion. Subsequent acts extended residency requirements and standardized procedures. The first federal restrictions on entry emerged in the late 19th century with the Page Act of 1875 and Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, targeting Asian laborers amid economic competition. Quota systems in 1921 and 1924 dramatically reduced numbers and favored Northern and Western Europeans. The McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 codified existing law, retained national origins preferences, ended full Asian exclusion, and added ideological grounds. The Hart-Celler Act of 1965 abolished discriminatory quotas, introducing family and skills preferences with per-country caps. Later measures addressed enforcement, amnesty, and security. Executive policies and mandates have supplemented statutes, varying by administration. This progression reflects shifting balances among economic needs, security concerns, humanitarian obligations, and demographic considerations. Comprehensive review reveals policy moving from minimal oversight to detailed statutory control. Part 1. Pre-federal and early federal immigration regulation. Immigration before national independence operated under colonial authority with no centralized rules. Colonies encouraged Protestant European settlement through land grants and incentives while excluding undesirables via bonds, taxes, and bans on public charges. British restrictions occasionally limited naturalization, contributing to revolutionary grievances. Forced arrivals of enslaved Africans and convicts bypassed voluntary frameworks. The Constitution granted Congress uniform naturalization power, but admission remained largely unregulated initially. The Naturalization Act of 1790 limited citizenship to free white persons after 2 years residency, prioritizing European compatibility for nation-building. Amendments in 1795 and 1802 extended residency to 5 years and required declaration of intent. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 authorized deportation of dangerous aliens and imposed registration, expiring amid controversy. The Steerage Act of 1819 mandated passenger manifests and conditions, marking early federal entry oversight. The Page Act of 1875 prohibited convicts, prostitutes, and Asian contract laborers, initiating racial restrictions. The Immigration Act of 1882 imposed head taxes and excluded idiots, lunatics, and likely public charges. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 banned Chinese laborers entirely, denying naturalization and extending repeatedly. The Immigration Act of 1891 created federal oversight through the Office of Immigration, expanding excludable categories and allowing deportation. The Act of 1903 added anarchists and political radicals to exclusions. The Naturalization Act of 1906 standardized citizenship procedures. The Immigration Act of 1917 imposed literacy tests and created the Asiatic Barred Zone, restricting most Asian migration. These measures reflected rising federal control amid industrialization and nativist pressures. Early policies balanced encouragement with selective barriers. Progression established statutory foundations for modern regulation. Part 2. Quota systems and mid-century codification. Numerical restrictions dominated mid-20th century policy, prioritizing European sources while addressing security concerns. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 limited annual admissions to 3% of each nationality's 1910 population, capping total inflows. The Immigration Act of 1924 reduced quotas to 2% based on the 1890 census, lowering overall limits and effectively barring Asians through non-quota status denial. These acts favored Northern and Western Europeans, aligning with demographic preservation objectives. The national origins system persisted, allocating tiny quotas globally. The McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 comprehensively codified immigration and naturalization law as the Immigration and Nationality Act. It retained national origins quotas favoring Europeans, abolished the Asiatic barred zone ending full Asian exclusion, and introduced preferences for skills and family. Ideological exclusions targeted communists and totalitarians, allowing deportation for past membership amid Cold War tensions. The act permitted citizenship revocation for certain beliefs and expanded consular authority over visas. Refugee provisions emerged outside quotas for displaced persons. Amendments addressed specific crises, admitting Hungarian refugees in 1956 and others post-revolts. The 1953 Refugee Relief Act provided non-quota visas for escapees. The 1965 amendments, known as the Hart-Celler Act, abolished national origins quotas entirely effective 1968. It established 7 preference categories emphasizing family reunification and employment skills, imposing 20,000 per country caps for the Eastern Hemisphere and later the Western. Immediate relatives remained unlimited. These changes shifted sources toward Asia and Latin America while maintaining numerical ceilings. The act reflected equality principles but underestimated chain migration effects. Mid-century policies transitioned from explicit racial preferences to non-discriminatory frameworks. Codification provided enduring statutory structure. Part 3. Post-1965 Reforms and Enforcement Measures. Post-1965 legislation addressed humanitarian needs, legalization, and interior enforcement amid rising unauthorized migration. The Refugee Act of 1980 created a permanent asylum system aligned with international standards, defining refugees and setting annual admissions. It separated refugee processing from general immigration. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 granted amnesty to approximately 3 million undocumented residents meeting residency and other criteria. It imposed employer sanctions for hiring unauthorized workers, increased border enforcement, and introduced fraud penalties. The Immigration Act of 1990 raised overall visa levels, expanded employment categories, created diversity visas for underrepresented countries, and enhanced enforcement resources. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996 significantly strengthened enforcement. It expanded grounds for deportation including aggravated felonies, imposed mandatory detention for certain categories, limited judicial review of removal orders, and introduced 3- and 10-year re-entry bars for unlawful presence. The act increased border barriers and personnel. Post-2001 measures like the USA Patriot Act and Enhanced Border Security Act mandated biometric screening, information sharing, and terrorist exclusions. The Real ID Act of 2005 established document standards for federal recognition. The Secure Fence Act of 2006 authorized extensive border fencing. Executive actions supplemented statutes, including deferred action programs, travel bans targeting specific countries, and enforcement priority memos. Temporary protected status designations provided relief for nationals of designated countries. In 2025, executive orders expanded travel restrictions to additional nations, paused asylum processing from high-risk countries, suspended refugee admissions, terminated certain TPS designations, and intensified interior removals. These achieved dramatic reductions in encounters and unauthorized inflows. Post-1965 policies balanced humanitarian expansion with growing enforcement mechanisms. Reforms reflected evolving priorities amid demographic shifts. Part 4. Executive Policies and Contemporary Mandates. Executive policies and mandates have increasingly shaped immigration outcomes absent comprehensive congressional reform. Deferred action initiatives provided temporary relief from deportation for certain childhood arrivals. Travel ban proclamations restricted entry from designated countries based on vetting deficiencies. Enforcement memos prioritized removal of criminal aliens or recent arrivals. Categorical parole programs facilitated specific group admissions. Temporary protected status extensions or terminations affected hundreds of thousands. Refugee sealing determinations varied annually. In recent years, policies alternated between expansive humanitarian processing and strict vetting requirements. 2025 mandates declared national emergencies at borders, expanded expedited removal nationwide, invoked public health authorities for entry restrictions, and centralized vetting procedures. Travel bans broadened to include countries with inadequate information sharing. Asylum cooperative agreements redirected applicants to third countries. Benefits processing paused for nationals of designated high-risk states pending enhanced screening. Refugee programs suspended pending review. Temporary protected status terminated for several designations. Interior enforcement prioritized public safety threats and recent entrants. These measures produced historic lows in border encounters and unauthorized presence. State-level policies varied, with some cooperating through agreements and others limiting participation. Public charge rules deterred dependency-based admissions. Visa sanction authorities pressured countries accepting deportees. Executive actions filled statutory gaps, responding rapidly to crises. Contemporary mandates emphasized sovereignty restoration and security enhancement. Policies demonstrated administrative flexibility within statutory bounds. Changes reflected immediate priorities over permanent reform. Conclusion: Key immigration acts in American history. Development of laws, rules, and mandates. United States immigration law evolved from colonial local controls through federal naturalization focus to comprehensive statutory regulation. Early acts prioritized European settlement while establishing racial citizenship boundaries. Late 19th century exclusions targeted specific nationalities amid economic pressures. Quota systems institutionalized numerical and preferential limits favoring traditional sources. Mid-century codification retained preferences while incorporating ideological grounds. 1965 reforms eliminated discriminatory quotas, emphasizing family and skills with uniform caps. Subsequent measures addressed refugees, legalization, and enforcement amid unauthorized growth. Security enhancements followed terrorist threats. Executive mandates increasingly directed outcomes, alternating between expansion and restriction. Recent 2025 policies intensified vetting, paused humanitarian processing from designated countries, expanded removals, and achieved substantial inflow reductions. These developments balanced economic, humanitarian, security, and sovereignty considerations. Policy progression reveals adaptation to demographic, geopolitical, and domestic changes. Statutory frameworks provided continuity while administrative actions enabled flexibility. Comprehensive overview demonstrates immigration regulation as dynamic instrument of national priorities. Laws and policies shaped inflows profoundly across eras. Evolution continues amid ongoing debates.